Welcome to the India Energy Hour podcast. I'm Shreya Jay, Energy and Climate Change Reporter with Business Standard. I, along with Dr. Sandeep Pai, Energy Transition Researcher from the University of British Columbia, co-host this podcast, which has received acclaim, critiques, suggestions, and most of all, a loving acceptance from our listeners. This is a special day for us. We are releasing our 10th episode today. When we started in January this year, we did foresee reaching this milestone, but we did not imagine the heights we will reach so soon. We are rated number 1 in the Apple Podcast list of science podcasts in India. According to Listen Notes, our listener score in just 5 months of our existence has made it to the top 10% of all podcasts across the globe. We have close to 2,500 listeners per episode across platforms. We are grateful to our esteemed listeners. I would like to take a moment to thank our guests who obliged us with their presence on our show. Vinay Rastogi, our first guest and a renewable historian no less. Dr. Rohit Chandra, the best storyteller on coal there is. Swati D'Souza, our dynamic voice on sustainable energy. Anil Swarup, one of the most frank bureaucrats we have met. Sumant Banerjee, a car expert with the choicest tales. Dr. Navroz Dubash, India's most balanced voice on climate change. Dr. Hisham Zarifi and Shalu Aggarwal, who took a leaf out of their own life and work to talk about energy access. Sunil Jain, a renewable veteran with an enviable passion. And Vijaya Ramchandran, whose work and words inspire beyond wonder. With such a decorated list of speakers, we traversed across coal, gas, clean energy, climate change, energy access, electric vehicles, and much more. With each episode, we learned so much more than we ever knew. And we really hope you all did too. So as we cross this milestone today, we have a special episode to offer. We are turning the tables. Today with us is Mayank Aggarwal, contributing editor, Mongabay India. Mayank is one of the best writers on environment and climate change in India, whose work has been a trailblazer. Mayank will be the host of the India Energy Hour podcast today. He will interview Sandeep Pai on his recently published dissertation on just transition and talk about the unique dataset that Sandeep used and the groundwork he did to underline the challenges of jumping from fossil fuel to clean energy in developing economies. Welcome to the show, Mayank. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you, Shreya, for having me over and for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you people. I have loved your work. I have loved all the episodes that you people have come out so far.
Before you take up the host mantle, Mayank, can you tell us about yourself? Where are you from? What did you study? How did you land up in journalism and also then decided to specifically cover environment issues?
I was born in Delhi and all my studies, everything happened in Delhi, including my school, college, everything. I did my graduation in journalism and mass communication. I started in 2003. While I was in third year of my college, I did one of the internships at the Statesman. And fortunately, I was absorbed when I was in the third year itself. So my third year went simultaneously with my job. And that is how I became a journalist in 2005. And while working, I also did my master's in international relations. So that is a little about my studies. But yes, there is an interesting story indeed about how I became a journalist. So I was a science student and I wanted to do robotics and astrophysics as an engineering arm. But somehow that never happened. I never got into the top colleges which were offering these courses. So when I gave my entrance examinations after 12th class, I gave 6 engineering entrance examinations and 1 mass communication entrance examination. And why I did that? Because news is something that has been always very close to me. When I used to go to school, so I used to ensure that no matter I am reaching late or early to the school, I used to ensure that I read the newspapers every single day before going to school. And civics, history, all the social sciences department was always one of my favorites. So somehow that media and that writing thing was always very close to me, even though my writing was pathetic that time. And I still consider that it is not great up to the mark as it is required. But yes, that feeling of or that thing about expressing myself in words was always there, or was always very strong. And I think that actually led me or took me to journalism, because another thing that actually was the reason was that I really enjoy conversations. and learning new things. And for me, media was also one of those avenues to do that. I started journalism, and like a lot of reporters, a lot of people, I started with the city beats, and I used to cover city crime, city politics, city administration, and but it was sometime in 2010 when I joined DNA that I actually started looking at environmental issues because, like a lot of organizations, environmental issues were not considered the top notch beat, or was like it was not the beat sought after beat for anyone. So it was like, okay, yeah, you keep doing it. And that is how I started. But what has changed, or how a couple of people in my life helped me change that perception, was when they repeatedly, like, and the to be honest, and the credit goes to my editors for that, because a lot of people, like those two three people, they actually inspired me to look at environment not as a niche subject, but as something that intersects with every single possible thing in our daily lives, whether it is business, whether it is politics, whether it is technology, whether it is infra. No matter what it is, environment is there at some form of intersection, and that has always been like my foundation for looking at those stories. So even though I started looking at environment, say 2010-11, it was in 2013-14 that this eureka happened. And that is how my perspective for environment journalism as a niche or as a mainstream subject changed. Because after that, I tried connecting every single story of mine. Sometimes I was successful, sometimes I was not. But I tried connecting every single story that I was doing with some form, one thing or another, whether it was some like army asking for land, anything. It has been an interesting journey so far, to be honest, and I like what I do. In fact, there was a bad time also when, not bad time, there was a low time also when I was looking at leaving journalism, to be honest. But yes, the past few years with Mongabay has changed that. The way I have been able to express myself on subjects that I wanted to write on, the way I wanted to cover things. All my organizations, wherever I have done environment journalism or other things, has been helpful. But yeah, I give special credit. Like I've learned from every organization. I have honed the kind of work that I wanted to do. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayank. Over to you now. The show is all yours.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you, Sandeep, for giving me this opportunity. Before I asked Sandeep to give a small introduction about himself, I wanted to tell the listeners one interesting thing. So, when I was in DNA in 2011, that is when I came to know, that is the year when I first spoke to Sandeep. Sandeep had just joined as a young reporter, and he had become the go-to person because of investigative skills. And he, with another reporter called Gangadhar Patil, they were the crack team of DNA, and they were the like go-to people. And the editor and everyone used to look at their stories. Every now and then they used to come out with investigative stuff. That is when I became friends with them. And when I had gone to Mumbai, it was then I realized that these are not just great reporters; they're great people as well. And fortunately, since then, we have been very good friends. I have learned a lot from him. I have seen his transition from a reporter to a researcher, and now a very serious name in the just transition field. And I really, really feel very proud of knowing him. I really feel very encouraged that I have seen this transition. I really enjoy that. So, Sandeep, before I shoot we start grilling you, I just wanted to understand. I just wanted to ask you if you can just give a small introduction. Even though this is your show, I know. Yeah, thank you, Mike. That I think is a really generous introduction. I've also really loved interacting with you over the years. I remember first we met in Mumbai and then in Delhi and then kept in touch. And it has really been great to be in touch and exchange ideas, on various topics, including more recently on just transitions. So yeah, it has been really great. I mean, my story is, like basically a story of many people from sort of like small town India. I grew up in Jharkhand, in Ranchi, and that sort of, went to a school and then immediately wanted to get out of Ranchi and
go somewhere else. The destinations were Bombay or Delhi or Bangalore. Every sort of like person, when they grow up in small towns, they have this desire to go and explore bigger cities. And so, after finishing my very average schooling record after 12th, like I don't remember how much exactly I had, but I had like average scores. I somehow cracked one engineering, like a government college sort of engineering course in Cochin, where I didn't have to pay any fees because it was a government sort of like university. And so I went and did my 4 years of engineering. I mean, Kerala was really transformative because while Kerala is like, really like it's a very progressive state. And so you get exposed to a lot of student politics, you get exposed to a lot of social issues. You see a lot of harmony among people, of various religion, caste, and so on and so forth. So I think in some ways my social and sort of like my social thinking was really shaped in Kerala. But when I finished my engineering, I was just like, this is not me. I cannot see myself sitting and coding and, doing stuff in front of the computer. I was, again, very interested in social issues. My lens has been always like social change, regardless of what I want to do or what. I mean, if I think about technology, it's not for technology per se. It's for can it help society, can it help people, and so on. So then what happened is that I finished engineering and I did like 1 year of journalism course in Bangalore with IIJNM. And as soon as I finished, I got recruited to DNA. We had a common but wonderful editor, Aditya Sinha. He gave me an opportunity to work in this investigative team. And that really helped shape who I am right now, because that was a time he allowed me to travel the country. When coal scam happened in 2014, I was just like covering mine after mine after mine. I was traveling to Chhattisgarh, to Jharkhand, to various parts of the country. I was reporting on defense, environment. Of course, one of the things in the investigative team was that I didn't have to cover daily beats. So I was really fortunate. And so that allowed me to really take time and work on stories. And that is basically what I did. I worked on, different stories. I learned a lot about RTI, how to file Right to Information Act applications, quite successfully in many, many cases. Of course, not always, but, there are methods and skills that one can deploy to learn about like how to do right to information. So during journalism, through interactions with people, I learned about RTI. I also really enjoy talking to people, interviewing people. So one of the great things about journalism is that you're paid to learn every day. And so that was really amazing. And, once I finished 5, 6 years in journalism, I thought to myself that, it'd be a good time to go and learn a little bit more in a more structured way. So I applied to a few master's programs. I got into one program, Erasmus program in Europe. So it was a very cool program. It went to like 4 different universities. The first semester I spent in Hungary. The second semester was in Greece. Third semester you spent in Sweden, and so on. And I wrote my thesis in California. And then once I finished your master's, I had this desire to do more work on energy transitions. And so, I was thinking about different kinds of topics, but somehow I sort of stumbled upon this topic of just transition during my master's. And that's when I sort of co-wrote a book with my then girlfriend, now wife. And that really sort of sparked my interest in the topic of just transition. And then I took it in a more structured way in my PhD, and I explored the topic further using more academic methods, using more systematic way of exploration of these topics. And that's sort of like finished 1 or 2 months ago when I submitted and defended my dissertation. And now finally the dissertation is out there for the world to see. So yeah, that is kind of, my journey. I don't know what I will cover in the future, but that has been sort of what I've done so far.
Thank you, Sandeep. Very interesting. I should tell one small insight. Sandeep is basically claiming that he somehow stumbled on the idea of energy transition. I feel that there is a lot of connection to the work that he did at DNA, because I remember some of the stories, initial investigative stories that he did, were from the coal belt of the country. And one way or another, when we generally say that our childhood impacts our whole life, so I think it is his life, or it is his experience during that the first job, that somehow left an impression on him. And because he also used to think from the social angle, so I think the work that he has done so far, and the work that we are going to talk about right now, is actually a proper product of his time during college, what he learned, or the impact that he had during college, the first job, the first few stories. Though we can debate what actually sparked his interest, whether it was the girlfriend or whether it was all this interest. So, yeah, we can debate about that. But yes, I felt that there is a connection, because I could see the whole trajectory from his stories on coal scam or coal problems in the country, to his work on now just transitions. So there's a huge arc. And like, for me as an outsider who is not Sandeep, but as his friend, I can see that arc. So yes, he has done fabulous work, and let's talk about it. So Sandeep, we have done Mongabay India has done a story on your dissertation, and I'm so thankful for you to, so grateful that you shared that with us. But like, for people who are not familiar with the concept, or people who are still to grasp it, will you mind if you can just explain a little about your research? Will you, or just tell us about what your research is about and how you went about it?
Yeah, great. I mean, essentially, my dissertation focuses on broadly energy transition and how world can move away from fossil fuels such as coal, oil, gas to renewables, and if that technological transition, infrastructure transition happens, the simple question is what happens to millions and millions of workers, fossil fuel workers, their communities, and entire regions. To say this more concretely, let's say in the Indian context, if you move away from coal, what happens to millions of workers, millions of people who rely on coal for their livelihood? States like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, which rely on government revenues, or sectors like railway, which sort of really deeply is subsidized by continuation of the coal industry. So the question is like, it's a human dimension of energy transition, essentially focusing on what really could be the alternatives of livelihoods and other dependencies when we move away from fossil fuels. So that is sort of the broad framing of my dissertation. And within that, I sort of explored four different key independent topics. So the first topic was I reviewed the global literature on just transition. And I did a review of academic papers primarily, but I also looked at some policy papers, like just transition task force reports of different countries. And it was a global review and came up with really like 17 key elements of just transition. So like if one were to design a just transition, what would be some of the key elements? So some of the key elements would include things like retraining, things like making sure local government revenues are restored if fossil fuels decline, uh, job transitions, making sure gender issues are properly addressed, and so on and so forth. So came up with 17 elements and also conceptualized them sort of in the form of spatial, temporal, as well as justice forms. So that was my one independent chapter. The second and the third chapter really looks at, it's a more narrow focus chapters. They look at really employment transition between energy sources like coal uh, and other fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas, and new energy sources such as renewables. So, can some of the people who are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry be transitioned to renewable jobs? So, the two chapters that are linked to this are, the first chapter kind of does a global review, or it's a more global modeling study that essentially projects from now until 2050 what happens if the world were to meet 1.5 or well below 2-degree climate target. So globally, world has set a target, Paris climate target of 1.5 degree. And so if the world were to meet that, what happens to energy sector jobs? Will there be more renewable jobs? Will there be less coal jobs? What would that happen? And how does it impact different regions of the world, like India or China or US? And so one of the innovations of that chapter was that I collected this really large data set, which will make public. The paper has been accepted, so it's going to come out in the next 10 days. And then you will see another big Twitter thread out of that. So it's a really large 50 country data set, which nobody else has collected. And what I collected was for 11 energy technologies, 5 job types. And then we use those employment factors, jobs per unit of energy, and apply with an integrated assessment model and make these projections into the future. And that data set will be really, really useful for future researchers. So that's one aspect. So one of the conclusions of that chapter is that yes, there will be more renewable jobs going into the future. And one of the caveats, I must say, that this is only looking at direct jobs. Although we can talk about it more in detail, but there are many types of fossil fuel jobs. But because of availability of data, we only focused on direct jobs. And we applied those direct jobs employment factors and then made projections. Now, one of the big conclusions is that yes, there will be more jobs globally, although not true for every region. But let's say in a country like India or US, there will be more direct renewable jobs compared to the jobs that will be lost in the fossil fuel industry. However, that led to a question, can you create some of these jobs locally? Right? It's one thing to create these jobs at a national level and there will be more net jobs. There'll be more jobs. But let's say you are creating nationally more jobs, but all the jobs are in Gujarat or Karnataka, but the job losses are happening in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. So will it be beneficial? So then in the next chapter, I explored whether can you create some of those jobs locally? And we only use 2 criteria and try to understand, are there suitable solar or wind resources to create those jobs locally? And what would be the scale of the job, sort of like the installations that you have to do locally to absorb the existing workforce? And that led to a conclusion that wind has no sort of like complete mismatch between where suitable wind resources are in the country, in India's case, compared to where the coal mining is happening. Although solar is suitable across sort of the coal belt. However, the scale of deployment that is required is huge. So you have to install something like 1,000 gigawatts. Right now, we have only 90 gigawatts of installation. So, I mean, it's not that we won't need that kind of installations in the future. We would. But you have to install that much capacity in those regions, in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, to absorb just the direct jobs. And this story was same. So this chapter focused on China, India, US, and Australia. And so this kind of story was similar. Wind had a complete mismatch around the world in all these countries, while solar was good in India and Australia, like moderate in US, about 60%. But China, the big story, where all like 50% of coal production happens. It was not suitable. Only 30% of the areas were suitable. Coal mining areas were suitable. So this sort of, you can conclude from this is that definitely not all fossil fuel workers can be absorbed locally. This was sort of the big conclusion emerging from this chapter. Those 2 chapters looked at the employment transition. The final one was more deeper and more close to home, looking at India's socioeconomic dependency of coal. And one of the motivations was that people throw multiple solutions of workers can migrate, like we can use agriculture to help these regions and so on and so forth. And so what motivated me was to really understand that how big is this dependency, right? Like before you understand the problem, I find it a bit like I mean, I should not use the word, but I find it a bit absurd that your people are throwing solutions without really understanding the depth of the problem. So that was the motivation. And so I basically first conceptualize what is coal dependency. And so the dependency is about jobs, dependency is about revenues, dependency is about cooking fuel that people collect and scavenge in some of these coal bearing areas. Dependency is about industrial fuel, dependency is about corporate social responsibility or CSR spending, and so on and so forth. So I conceptualized this dependency, and then I collected 6 large data sets using basically right to information RTI Act applications. And I had to file a bunch of first appeals, because first they rejected it and then I had to file an appeal and so on. But in the end, I managed to get these 6 data sets, and I quantified direct and indirect jobs, CSR spending, district mineral fund revenues, and coal pensioners, right? There are almost 6 lakh coal pensioners. And in 10 years, there's projections that it may become almost, 10 lakh and so on. So I basically collected all this data at a district level because the impacts will be really high on districts. And then came up with this really interesting result that it seems that almost 40% of Indian districts have some kind of coal dependency. Although dependency really varies. I mean, for some districts, it's really, really low among this 40%, but for some, it's extremely high, right? Like, you have like more than a lakhs of jobs in one district, more like 50,000 pensioners in another district. But the key conclusion was that dependency really varies from district to district. And so the big conclusion again is that when you create any plans, you can't have one consistent plan for all districts because the dependency is really different. So yeah, that is kind of the 4 chapters of my dissertation. I think I took a long time, but that essentially I think sets up any further questions you have on this.
Oh, absolutely, it does. Before we move forward, I must tell that similar conversation I had with him, and that is that conversation had given me headline for my story that we published on his dissertation recently, which said that almost 40% of India's districts have some form of coal dependency, and the headline goes like that only. Yeah, but one thing I also wanted to tell, it's another anecdote. What I have really liked in Sandeep's work throughout his journalism and researcher work now is his use of RTI. And RTI has been kind of something very close to me because before I became a journalist in 2005, 2003 and 4, I have worked with a couple of national NGOs who were working to get India's national RTI law passed. So that has been one subject that is very close to my heart always. And when I see the proper use of RTI and somebody using it so productively, it really, really makes me very happy. I can't tell joy because all these years even after becoming a journalist, I have been trying to help people to file RTIs. And in fact, just before we started recording this podcast, I got a call from one of the NTPC workers who wanted to file an RTI to get the annual report. So yes, that is the only thing I want to. So going with your, explanation about your research, I have this one question which I wanted to understand. When we talk about jobs, direct jobs, both from coal and renewable sector, like even if we may end up creating more jobs or we may not with renewable, there is a basic difference I understand in the kind of jobs that the renewable sector offers and the fossil fuel, the coal sector offers. And there's also, apart from that basic difference, it's also the facilities that comes with those kind of jobs. So a coal worker gets a lot of social benefits, whether it is in terms of health, whether it is in terms of pension, but and they have unions which can demand their rights. But when we are looking at stating at say 450 gigawatt of renewable power by 2030, which is next 9 years, we are not even talking about that. Even when that has been one huge issue in countries like US, where the elections are fought on issues like having a union in the renewable sector, which the President Biden promised. So how do you look at this mismatch, or how do you look at this whole debate about the renewable and coal sector jobs? if I've made myself clear.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an excellent question. So yeah, I mean, I agree that coal sector is probably one of the most unionized sectors in India, right? Like it's it's the Coal India, which is the world's largest coal mining company, and it's nearly 100% unionized. And you have really strong five unions, which represent five largest political parties in the country, from BJP to the smallest CPM. So coal sector unions are really strong. They're deeply embedded. Uh, they still hold a lot of power, although over the years their power has sort of declined. But it is one of the last frontiers of large scale union in India, even though this fact is less appreciated by people who don't cover this sector. But it is a fact that they're really well unionized. Now, in terms of renewables, I'm not aware of any union. I mean, it could be that I don't know. But even if something exists, it may be an isolated sort of union here and there. And the reason for that, I mean, if you think about renewable generation, most of the jobs are in construction, right? If you want to install a large scale solar plant, or if you want to install wind power, most of the jobs are temporary construction jobs for the first sort of like 2 years or 3 years or 1 year. And so you have this splurge of, sort of workers who come, who set up solar plant, and then move on. So the scope of unionization is less there. After you have done that, you don't need many people. You're only like looking at very few number of people who run the show there, and you need some security guards, some cleaners, and some engineers, and so on. So it's really hard to unionize. So that by nature it's difficult. That's number one. The number 2 point with renewables is that it's largely a private sector, although NTPC and others have right now entered the renewable space, but it's dominated by private companies who have traditionally not encouraged unionization. So this difference in the way the two sectors are structured makes these jobs sort of like completely different, apples and oranges. One is pensionable, full time, completely unionized public sector jobs, versus like largely private sector, non-unionized, sort of like we don't know much about what kind of social security it offers and so on. I think a little bit more research is required into the kinds of social security measures or whatever is offered in the renewable space. But it's basically a private company run sector. So with that being the difference, my studies, and that is the limitation of my study and many of the just transition studies, is that I look at job numbers, not so much job quality. Because once you look at job quality, I think that will make a huge difference. I think a coal worker's job may or may not be comparable to, a person who works for Coal India is like absolutely not comparable to somebody who's working sort of in a renewable setting. Although maybe if you are a higher management or something, that's different. But if you're comparing blue collar to blue collar in both industries, I don't think it's comparable. I think a blue collar worker in a coal industry in NTPC or Coal India is much better off, perhaps, than renewables. But I will add a caveat that there much more research is required from a renewable side to really understand if some of what I'm saying is true. This is all based on anecdotal evidence, but I think if those jobs were really attractive, we would know by now.
A very valid argument indeed. And during our stories, also, that was one of the questions we tried to explore. So, just asking one more follow up on that. Can energy transition actually be just until and unless the rights of people involved in the renewable energy sector are ensured? Or just like many other sectors, we are like, will move forward with this whole happiness that we are cleaning the environment and thing, and while ignoring the rights of such people who are going to be involved across the country or for this sector.
I think it's Mayank, you're asking really impressive questions. So there's two school of thoughts here. It's not an India story. I mean, this is sort of across academia that I have seen about this topic. There's two really school of thoughts. One says climate change is the biggest problem, right? Like it is sort of like the biggest problem the world is facing. We have to deploy really fast, least cost deployment, right? Like build the cheapest renewables, just deploy, right? We cannot think about jobs and other stuff. Those are co-benefits. But you sort of deploy and deploy and deploy, and this is really, really important that we make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper so that, they start to displace fossil fuels. And so that's line of thought doesn't care. I mean, or cares, but sort of like justice is second to them. They think about justice in terms of climate justice, which is sort of like, we have to make sure that communities don't suffer due to the impacts of climate change. And so renewable deployment is the most important thing. The second school of thought is that, as we move to new sources, we don't want to create more inequalities. We don't want to sort of create more injustices that fossil fuel industries have done in the past. And so this is sort of an ongoing debate. The big pressure, the big externality, or sort of the big pressure here is we have to do things fast to address climate change. So I don't know which line of thought will win, but in India's case, I mean, anyway, the least cost model is winning, right? Like people are bidding cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's not so much about, I mean, people will say it's about jobs and stuff, there's co-benefits and stuff. But at the end of the day, everybody is just bidding like 2 rupees, 2.5 rupees. And the whole motivation is sort of cheap power, cheap deployment so that we can displace fossil fuels. So I'm not sure how to ensure this justice, but very much, I think within the broad just transition framing, we have to think about land issues, for example. Like, you don't want to, and Mayank, you have covered this topic extensively about land, what happens to renewable deployment and land and so on. So, I mean, for me, the lens of just transition and my own thinking has evolved. I used to focus on just fossil fuel workers, but now I think more in terms of winners and losers. Like, you want to mitigate the losers, right? There'll be many winners of transition, healthy communities, better water, clean electricity, and so on. But there'll be many losers of transition. And one has to understand both the categories of losers, but also the scale of people who are losing, and try to create policies to mitigate some of those losses. So, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but that's sort of my conceptual thinking of this topic.
So this actually word that you just used in your answer, cheap, actually stuck with me because I'm cheaply plugging all my stories that I have done on the subject. But yes, what I wanted to understand also from you is this: when we look at, like, your research is absolutely very comprehensive. I have loved reading it, and it's actually given me a lot of ideas to work on for more stories. But there is one thing which constantly, impacts me is this: when we say just transition, we very happily talk about clean energy. But clean energy has a lot of limitations, and clean energy has a lot of issues to be dealt with when we are talking about clean supply chain per se. So for example, my plan for electric mobility, my plans for renewable power, which will help my environment or my country's environment, may trigger a lot of work, a lot of mining, a lot of conflicts in other countries. For example, India's clean energy revolution requires a lot of materials, a lot of minerals, which are not even mined in India. So ultimately, our clean energy revolution will end up displacing communities, or hurting environment, or polluting the water sources in other countries across the world. Whether it is like some country in Latin America, Australia, China, wherever, it will end up hurting communities and environment there. Basically, what I want to ask is how do you look at that issue as a context when we talk about just transition? And also, if you just can throw a little light on while you were doing this study, because that's the general habit of reporters. When they finish their work, they generally feel that, oh, I could have also used this as part of my dissertation or my work or something like that. So, is there anything that you feel that was a limitation while you were doing this dissertation? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so to your point, I think world will need a lot of critical minerals, right? Like a lot of it currently is coming from polysilicon, is coming from Xinjiang, And there's lots of allegations of human rights abuse. And some people also say it's genocide. Information is hard to get. There's a lot of allegations. And so a lot of this clean energy revolution is really hinging on, some of the injustices around the world. I don't think there is a clear-cut answer of how to deal with that. At the same time, deploy cheap renewables, which is sort of the focus. So I guess, justices have many forms. It varies spatially, it varies temporally. Like today, something which is sort of like great renewables may not be great after 20 years when you have to dispose them off and so on. So it will vary spatially. There's layers of justice. There is distributive justice. I'm going a bit theoretical here, but there is also procedural justice. Are you deploying renewables by talking to people? Like, have you taken local communities into sort of confidence, or you're just going and deploying? Or there is restorative justice, right? You have sort of like, already degraded that land and you're degrading it more. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that it's not clean energy revolution is not necessarily fully clean per se. There's lots of issues that one has to resolve. And we have actually not really started this revolution, even though people, love to say that, we are deploying massively, but fossil fuel still dominate global energy systems, right? Over 80%. So once we really scale up in the 20s and in the 2030s and so on, a lot of these issues will emerge. And so I think we as researchers and reporters, it's our duty to sort of highlight some of those social issues, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're solving one big climate problem, but creating hundreds and thousands of, maybe millions of injustices around the world. I think that would be my role going forward, not just with just transition, but sort of any topic you take, you have to think more socially, more broadly, thinking about losers and winners. How do you manage different expectations? Because it's very easy to meet climate targets using models, right? And one of my studies also relied on models, because it's basically, it's like a tool. You sort of set your objective function, and you say, okay, this is the carbon budget. We have to deploy this much. You make a bunch of assumptions, say that solar price in 2030 will be this much. You make assumptions about coal. You make assumptions about carbon tax. You say that India will have this much carbon tax. Some of that may have no connection to the political realities, but you make those assumptions because they give you some pathways into the future. You're thinking about pathways. We can talk about whether these models are useful or not, but that's a different debate. But, it's easy to do all these things in a justice. And I mean, these models don't even think about justice, to be frank. Their whole focus is optimal least cost sort of thinking. And when you do that, it's easy, but real life is messy, right? It's going to be really complicated. I mean, already in 90 gigawatts, I think some of the land issues, even our previous guests had talked about it. And that's one question actually I wanted to ask you. You have done reporting about land, renewables and land and so on and so forth. I don't know if you want to talk about that. But it'll be great to hear your views on like what has been your experience thinking about justice and sort of more specifically about land issues around renewables and so on.
So you're turning the tables. Okay, interesting. I'll be very frank with you, Sandeep. We have done, say, over 60, 65 stories over the last 1 year on this subject. And one good section has been devoted to, at Mongabay India, we have devoted to looking at the clean energy aspects of the renewable energy, that how clean actually they are. And to be honest, one thing that we have discovered is the government quickly and swiftly moving towards huge renewable parks and the stepping of big corporates. We have already seen example. It is actually leading to a lot of land and environmental conflicts. So it's just that the perpetrator has changed, but the community and the environment which was facing injustice, whether it was the hand of coal mining or issues related to that, they still face the issue. they still face injustice. Like there are several cases I found that are going on in courts right now across the country, where communities are complaining that the land which has been taken over by the government for this huge solar park and then given to a private player is basically a land which is their community land, or it is a unique ecosystem. So what governments may claim in the papers as a degraded wasteland may not be so ultimately in actual terms. So there are so many cases going on across the country, and that's a very sad part, because when you talk about a sunshine sector, when you talk about a sector which is coming up so fast and everything, everybody's going gaga about it. These are issues that needs to be dealt with. These are issues that needs to be addressed, and that is one thing which actually led us to write several stories on that. And in fact, a couple of more are coming in the next couple of weeks. But yes, this is one thing. And absolutely, it is a trend that you said in 2020s and 2030s, in the next 15, 20 years, whether it is about the waste coming from the renewable sector, whether it is about the land issues, whether it is about the impact on wildlife, avifauna, all these issues are going to blow up. And I don't want to be somebody making bad predictions. I don't want to be Nostradamus or anything. But yeah, it it is going to make a huge impact. It is going to, when we say that climate change is going to impact such huge investment across the country in different regions, if we don't listen to research, I think it is a similar thing going to play out with the renewable sector in India, because the way it is just being pushed down that road. I remember there was this project recently which is being pushed by Gujarat in the in one of the most ecologically sensitive areas. I think it is near Bhuj, and if I remember it right, yes. And it is a 60,000 megawatt, 60,000 or 40,000 megawatt project. Sorry, 41,000 megawatt project in 60,000 hectare area, which is size of nearly like the size of Mumbai region. And imagine that much land is going, and you can imagine the kind of impact it is going to have uh, on people and communities. You don't need to be a scientist to understand that. So I think it is playing out. It is going to become a very dangerous point, and it will lead to a lot of conflicts for sure. And I must remind you, you forgot to answer my limitations questions on limitations of the study. I will not let you go. You have to answer that.
So apologies. Like every study, every dissertation has multiple limitations. I think there are some broader limitations. The broader limitation, and partly it was because of COVID that I couldn't do it, but I can't just blame COVID and get away with it. One of the big limitations, sort of my dissertation, is that I did not systematically talk to workers. I mean, although I have spent a lot of time in coal communities before, but in the process of my dissertation, I could not travel. I had travel plans to come to India. I also wanted to do some field work in Alberta here in Canada, but I could not do it because of COVID. But so that, not systematically incorporating workers' views, I think is one big limitation of my whole dissertation. I think there are many other sort of data limitations. I could not, for example, for the India socioeconomic dependency work, I could not collect data on informal jobs. Now, that I think is a really important piece of research going forward, because unlike in the Western countries, India has a large informal sector. There's lots of millions of people, although it's not properly quantified yet, millions of people who scavenge coal, right? When coal mining is, on the sidelines of coal mining, or when coal mining is, abandoned, people go and scavenge coal. People, extract that coal, and then use that coal for cooking purposes or selling in the open market, and so on and so forth. And this is an underrepresented stakeholder in this conversation. So I think that in the future, one has to think about how to quantify their numbers, how to understand their dependency. And honestly, like once we quantify that, some of my results might change, right? Because some districts may have more of these informal workers compared to others and so on. So that again is a very specific data limitation. Of course, the modeling chapters has hundreds of assumptions, like every other modeling chapter. I would not do justice by saying that there are no assumptions. There's lots of assumptions about cost. There's lots of assumptions about average employment factors and so on and so forth. But I mean, I have tried to be as transparent as possible about, in my end of my dissertation, I've listed as many limitations as possible. But yeah, that's why I always say that don't take the exact numbers seriously, but take the trends seriously. Because even when you have limitations, you understand the scale, for example, you understand that coal mining has much larger socioeconomic impact than power plant, rather than, the number I am projecting is 80%, but it could be 75, it could be 85, but you can clearly see that coal mining is bigger. So there are a bunch of limitations, which are also an opportunity for more research going forward, because, you do some research, tomorrow somebody else will quantify something else. You add on and you build. That's how sort of science or social science research works. So yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of limitations. I just gave a few examples just to give a flavor of the kinds of limitations I have.
And do mark my words when I say I've been writing on the subject and I've been a reporter for the last 16 years. So when I say this, a good researcher or person whose intentions are clear can be actually understood from the fact that what Sandeep just mentioned, that at the end of his dissertation, he mentions a lot of areas that needs to be worked on, that needs further research. So if any research is actually mentioning, is telling, give credit to that person, because that person is being very honest with his work. That person is being very honest with the subject. So yes, kudos to you for that. And what I also wanted to now ask you, I want to take this to a little hypothetical, philosophical, or in a different mode. We keep talking about just transition. We have understood what. Thank you so much for explaining it in such clear words. Do you think that there is a political will? Do you think that there is money for this? Because, like, as we talk about climate change finance, this is another of that, I'll not say oxymoron, but yes, it is another of those great words which is now in the regular lexicon. But do you actually think that there is, and just very brutal truth, where do you actually think that there is political will and money available for just transition?
Again, a really interesting question. So, coming to the political will part, right? I mean, it's very clear from the policymakers in India. Nobody's talking. Look, at least policymakers who matter. They're not talking about transitioning away from coal. I mean, India is still adding more coal-fired power plants. I mean, the numbers may vary, but I think about 60 gigawatts of coal power plants are still either under construction or pre-construction stage. I don't know what will happen after this round of more coal capacity. I don't think coal use in India has peaked. I don't think anyone, at least anyone who matters at the government level or anybody else, is really saying transition away from coal. What we could really see is that one can talk about peaking coal use rather than saying full transition. So I don't think that we don't know yet if there is political will or not, because that stage has not reached yet. And I mean, to be fair, India has massive power requirements, and so there is, even within the research community, there is a debate whether to what degree should India rely on coal and for how long. So to conclude this point, what I'm trying to say is that there is no overarching. I mean, there may be some plants closing here and there, but there is no overarching transition away from coal. So we don't know in terms of political will that once that stage reaches where you don't need more capacity, or you can start to talk about phasing out, what kind of political will be there. And some of that will actually be shaped by the response of coal communities. If Jharkhand starts to protest about a coal phase out, or a Telangana starts to protest, that will feed back into whether we have more political will. This jobs is a very contentious political issue. We have seen around the world, right? Like from US to everywhere. This will become a really deeply contentious political issue going forward. So to answer that question, I'm not sure in terms of moving away from coal, whether there is political will or not. Although there is massive renewable plans, which shows some kind of political will, right? It really shows actually political will to move in the clean energy direction, but not so sure if you can link it back to sort of like transitioning away from coal. So that's the other part. The money, the finance part is fascinating, right? I mean, we always talk about clean energy deployment and the finance that is required around it, which is well and good. And of course, we need lots of money to actually address climate change. We need massive investments in renewables. 450 gigawatts is this decade's target, but even in the future, we'll continue to need more finance to deploy renewables. But nobody is really talking about how to manage the just transition finance aspect. And to give you an example, and I think I talked about this in the last episode also, Coal India has about $15 billion that it contributes in salaries and in various things, US dollars. And so, if a Coal India dies, and I'm not saying it'll die now, or when you move away from coal and if Coal India doesn't manage to diversify, how do you manage that finance? Who is going to fund some of the aspects of transition? I think we are not there yet. So the research is also not out there. One cannot provide a number of how much money would be required for all this. But I think that conversation has to start. And that conversation will start now because a lot of groups are now very interested in this topic. And I think more and more research will happen, more and more quantification will happen. And some of the things that I, for example, quantified, one can apply to IEA net zero targets. And then you can say, in 2030, we will have these many workers and these many people will lose jobs. So what would be their salary and so on and so forth. And then you can start to quantify the scale of money that is required to make sure that A, either there's status quo, or B, you actually provide just transition, and so on and so forth. So I am partially answering both your questions, but I think that is where we are at. India has not reached a stage where coal is declining. So the just transition is more like these things take a lot of time, right? You cannot have a state like Jharkhand diversify when coal starts to decline. You have to plan some of those processes now. And so from a research point of view, this is a stage where you learn about these things. You inform policy. You start that process now. And then once you quantify more and more, you would know the money requirement. And some of that money can come from domestic sources, but some of the money has to come from international sources. I don't think India will be able to afford everything sort of on its own, managing both the clean energy and the just transition aspects.
That actually takes me to one interesting conversation I had and an issue that we covered in another of my stories, which was about using a lot of money coming from different CES, DMF, and other sources, and using it to because as you said, we have not peaked on coal, so probably another 20, 25, 30, 40 years, whatever time. Nobody of us knows absolutely. Yeah. So using that money to create long-term assets to at least start working on that long-term just transition in those areas. So that is one thing that has actually evoked a lot of interest in my work. And I'm really looking forward to explore more of that. But yeah, that is one interesting area that I want to understand and I wanted to point out. I also wanted to ask you when you have been researching and you have been reading a lot of reports, and we have recently seen some of the India's biggest corporates joining the clean energy bandwagon. So, how do you look at this whole mining industry? How do you look at this whole coal mining industry being prepared for just transition? And is that even a thing on their mind? Is that even on their radar?
The short answer is no. Like I said, the coal has not peaked yet, the coal use. So Coal India still has targets to double its production, right? So from 700 something to almost like a billion. So not double, but sort of like really increase its production. Now we have auctions of coal mines as well. So essentially, government wants to double or at least like substantially, at least 50% increase coal use. So the transition as a topic, just transition as a topic, has really come from researchers to the discourse right now. It's the research community that is talking about it. It's people, iForest and some of the people like me and others who are talking about this topic. Just transition has been a very big topic globally. Wherever transitions have started, decline of coal in US or Europe and so on. And so it's become a contentious issue. Lots of money has gone in to retrain and take care of workers and so on. So the international agencies that are in these countries are funding just transition work in India because they see that this could become a really contentious topic going forward. And so a lot of just transition discourse is really coming from both global sort of like funding agencies, researchers, and it's penetrating different discourses. But from a mining, as far as I've had hundreds of conversations with people with Coal India and so on, I don't think anybody has even thought about this topic, to be very frank. But this discourse is increasing. I mean, in the last 5 years, like in 2015, not one person would know what just transition is. Or, I mean, obviously some people would know, but essentially very few. But now you see, even I have seen coal secretary use this word, and many others are sort of starting to use this. At least the vocabulary is coming there, but and this is only going to grow as we go forward.
I actually have a question for both of you. I really tried hard to just be a listener here. Consider this as an audience question. And this comes from just my observation purely based on the fact that since the time I've started writing, I've been listening about decline of coal. Uh, when you talk about just transition, why are we placing the responsibility on conventional energy sources or conventional companies, for that matter, conventional policies as well? District mineral fund will go away. Oh, what will happen to these coal bearing areas? I have a problem with that, and I'll tell you why. My problem is that all the money, the future is green energy. And what one thing that green energy gets away with is anything in the name of green energy. So, be it land, be it killing birds, be it transmission network or anything, it's the green energy, wind, solar plants, batteries, the impact that, disposing of these batteries will have, maybe 10 years later in India, but they will have an impact on ecology. So, do you not? I'll want to ask a view from both of you that this responsibility of just transition, of saving our ecology, or giving more employment, having a whole supply chain, should lie now on green energy rather than on a fuel that is tend to go away in another 10 years.
I can start. This is one of those questions where like I should not have been here, but this is such a powerful question. Uh, I think I mean so let me answer that question in two parts. I think Shreya, like the first part is theoretically, I think they could have some responsibility. They should have some responsibility because you're talking that this is a sustainable, clean, green energy, right? So some of this transition money or transition sort of planning, they could choose to invest in a state like Jharkhand, set up manufacturing plants and so on. So that might take care of some of these just transition aspects. But again, everything is coming down to least cost here. So at a theoretical level, I don't disagree. I mean, we at a philosophical level, sure. I think some of this just responsibility. People talk about how the world will be sustainable when we transition away from coal. So when you think about sustainability in absolute terms, perhaps some of that sustainability can also transfer to people and areas which decline. So I agree at a theoretical level, but at a more practical level, I don't see any company, Adani, or you name it, even NTPC, going and investing in a state like Jharkhand, right? They will invest where they find ease of doing business, or where there's already like good transmission infrastructure or whatever. They'll make their business plans based on profit. And so profit, while clean energy and green energy is all well and good, but at the end of the day, this is a business proposition for many. Even though they may have ESG plans, and they may have all sorts of PR around this, but at the end of the day, this is a huge business opportunity. And so at a theoretical level, I can see one talking to them about it, and they may even saying, yeah, sure. But at a practical level, at the end of the day, it's driven by profit. So I'm not quite convinced that they will play a role. And so everything is going back to our traditional same old coal Indias of the world, and, like companies who have operated on those difficult areas, who have operated. And not that coal India is pure, and it has its own set of problems. It has not taken care of the environment. It has led to unsustainable mining and so on. But it is a welfare state. It provides schools and so on. So yeah, so I think theoretically I agree, but practically I don't think it'll happen.
I have several comments, to be honest. A couple of points. For example, one, in a country such as India, or for that matter, any other country, everything is driven from politics. And if we just live in silos, and if we just compartmentalize, we can say that renewable energy industry, it's not renewable energy industry. It is the system. And when we talk about the system driving the whole thing, I think there is a learning from this whole our experience with coal and the way we are moving ahead with renewables, and the reality that Shreya has asked this question means there is a huge conversation around it already, whether it is about unions in the sector, whether it is about the impact of renewable energy on land, the impact of renewable energy on environment, the justice with the communities there. So this question is already there, and it's a very valid argument that why not now? Why shouldn't they? And one part, Sandeep has already answered that it's a low cost model. And the companies, to be fair to the companies, on one part, I generally don't like to be, take sides with the business, but there's one simple thing that we also need to remember. A lot of companies which went for this low cost model went into auctions, got auctions, got clearances in auction. Now, the states where they, went into contracts, those states are renegotiating contracts, or, forcing the companies to abandon the projects and go for, restart the auction process. So, in such a scenario, how do we expect, or how can we expect the companies to lower their margins and then also contribute to the welfare? So somewhere that's why I said that it's a whole system of politics attached to this energy, which is basically driving this, and which will make whether the issue of the unions or whether the issue of these green energy companies or green energy business contributing to the welfare work. Because ultimately, if we are going to drive the whole work by the model of low cost and giving electricity either as free or as at the lowest possible cost, the companies are not, it's business. So companies are not going to decrease their margins. They may just by a small extent, but they're not going to do that in a larger context. And if they're not going to do it, that money that we are talking about, which it comes in terms of coal and other fossil fuel based industries, that's not going to come. So it's a very valid demand. I think we especially I'm talking about myself, me as a reporter may not be able to think in such a big context, but it's time. It should strike a debate. I think there is a debate already in progress at some places, but the debate needs to go broad based. And I think there's a huge space for this conversation around this issue. That is there a way that the green energy industry can contribute to or carry forward this mantle from the coal based industry and provide that, extra push to the communities, or provide that cushion to the communities, or that fund that can come from them, whether in a cooperative manner or whatever. It could be any model discovered. So that's all open for debate. And one more thing, we have been writing on this. Please read our stories on this, because we have been writing a lot of stories on these issues. Sandeep, now I just wanted to, we talked about the social aspect, we've talked about all these issues. I just wanted to ask one more question that has been on my mind. It's about the impact of the whole coal sector on the health of people. That is something that requires a lot of studies. Some people claim that these studies have been done. Some people have been working on these issues. Have you dealt with this issue, and how do you look at what is your take on this?
I mean, so I have not personally gone and done like academic scientific studies on this, but as a reporter, I have traveled to these areas, and I mean, there's no question. Even I don't think even a Coal India, like anybody honest, would go and say that it's like clean and green there. At least they are not claiming it in that industry. But look, the water is dirty. You can argue about the scale of whether it's to what degree. There's pollution. There's all sorts of environment. There's land subsidence, which is a huge issue especially in the Raniganj, Jharia area, where sort of when coal fires are there. And so there's lots of different kinds of health and environmental issues. And absolutely, there's no question about it. And from time to time, people come up with those studies linking them to air pollution, deaths, and so on and so forth. I'm not an expert on that, but I can tell you from anecdotal experience that people really suffer from these environmental and health impacts in these extraction areas. There's no question about that. But at the same time, that the dependency is there, and we are talking about moving away from this, away from this source. So while people have suffered, many people have suffered. Some of them have jobs, and they suffer, but they at least have livelihood and some kind of sustainable sort of like ongoing sustainable livelihood and so on. So the central question is already injustice has happened in some of those areas. And so when you move away from these sources, yes, a little bit of air will improve, but people have suffered, and you don't want them to suffer even more in this clean energy world. And so, yeah, so my thinking is that I think anybody who denies environmental or health impacts in coal mining areas, I think they're lying. I think there is serious impacts. At the same time, we should recognize the complexity of the problem, that it does provide jobs and revenues and so on. So a lot of people rely on this sector for their livelihoods. It's a large industrial sector. It's an ecosystem, as I define in my dissertation. So as we move to new systems, we have to make sure that people are not left behind. You don't create more injustices in these areas. So that's sort of how I think about this.
Thank you, Sandeep. That brings me to the last question. Otherwise, people will say that this is an injustice to them to bore to them for such a long episode. I wanted to ask you, what now? Because the sooner you come out with a new paper, new work, the sooner I can write more stories on that. So exactly. So what next now?
Yeah, so I mean, I finished my PhD, and now I'm working with a large think tank which is Washington DC based think tank called Center for Strategic and International Studies. In fact, I'm continuing my work because this topic has sort of really taken the energy community, or the climate and energy community by force. And so many groups are now working on different aspects of just transition. So the World Bank's climate investment funds and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, they have a collaboration, and they have started what is called the Just Transition Initiative. And so this year, I joined that initiative, and I'm now a senior researcher working in this initiative. And this year, we are doing a study comparing Jharkhand, which is obviously India's most coal-intensive, coal-dependent state, and Mpumalanga, which is South Africa's most coal-intensive state. And so I've been doing a lot of interesting research on that. It should come out before the Glasgow COP, but there are lots of similarities and differences between these two places. And so we are trying to understand a bunch of things, including how can these two places diversify their economy? How can, environmental remediation, so cleanup of mines and power plants, become sort of a source of employment, but also, help attract industries for diversification. We are also thinking about like who are the key stakeholders. We often, there's a tendency that there is more voice to researchers and people like me or people sitting in Delhi, but the actual stakeholders on the ground never, are able to voice their concerns, and they are not part of this just transition thinking. So we're doing a mapping exercise of identifying who are the key stakeholders on the ground in these two places. And so, all in all, this is going to be a very interesting comparative study between Mpumalanga, which is their most coal-intensive province in South Africa, and Jharkhand in India. And essentially, the research will culminate around October, November, and then we'll come up with a big report on that.
And I call dibs on that report.
Yes.
No. But to be honest, like, I'll just add one thing before I hand it over back to Shreya. Last year when we started this series for Mongabay India, when we started Just Transitions as a series, as a subject, honestly telling you, for the first 2, 3, 4 months or the first quarter of that series, I actually struggled to explain the concept to people. I used to, for like any call that I used to make to researchers or people or policymakers, I used to at least make it a point that I first explained to them the international concept of just transitions and the expanded concept that we were taking in our stories and everything, the whole setting the context thing. And the way the topic or the way the issue has, exploded in the last 1 year is absolutely mind-boggling. Now, there are organization after organization after group after researchers that is involved in energy transition or just transitions per se, and it is very heartening to see everybody like the term actually becoming very popular. And just being a little greedy, I do like to take a little credit for doing that. But yes, it is very heartening to see the subject going places, and it is very heartening that we have been talking about it. And I hope to see more work on coming from you and your friends in the academia, and to write more on that. Thank you so much, and thank you, Shreya, for giving me the opportunity to come and have this lovely conversation. It actually, made me remember a lot of my conversations over the last 1 year, over the last 10 years with him. So thank you so much, and you people have been doing this great show, and I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayank. It was just really amazing to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Mayank and Sandeep. It was such an enjoyable conversation, so much that I couldn't help myself but pitch in. I hope the dialogue that you both have started, Sandeep with your research and Mayank with your special coverage, ignites changes in policy making and investment decisions of stakeholders. This brings us to the end of our special. We will be bringing out more such great conversations regularly. If our listeners have any suggestions for our future episode, do reach out to us on our social media handles. Thank you.